June 14th, 2019. 2:47 in the afternoon. Howard Dennison was 67 years old, and he was cutting his second hay crop alone in a field 3 miles west of his house in Audrain County, Missouri. The New Holland 688 round baler behind his tractor had been running for 21 years. He'd bought it used in 1998 for $8,200 from a retiring neighbor. It had 11,000 bales on the counter when he brought it home. By that June afternoon, it had rolled 47,300. The temperature was 91 degrees. The humidity made it feel like working inside a wet towel. Howard had been in the field since 6 that morning. He'd stopped once to grease fittings and once to eat 2 sandwiches sitting on the tongue of the baler in the shade it didn't really provide. He had 140 acres left to bale. The forecast called for rain Sunday night. It was Friday. He needed to finish. At 2:47, the baler made a sound it had never made before. Not the usual clatter, not the belt squeal he'd learned to ignore. Something underneath, something final. He kept the tractor moving for another 10 seconds because stopping meant accepting what he already knew. Then the baler seized completely, and the tractor engine lugged down hard enough that he had to clutch out or stall. Howard sat there in the cab with the engine idling and looked back at the baler through dust that hung in the air like powder. He didn't get out right away. If you're someone who understands that farming is about the long years, not the good seasons, if you know that equipment decisions carry weight that doesn't show up until decades later, this channel tells those stories. We don't rush, we don't exaggerate, we follow the consequences. Subscribe if that matters to you. Early context. Howard Dennison had been farming 480 acres of pasture and hay ground since 1979. He'd inherited 200 acres from his father and bought the rest in 3 parcels over 15 years. He ran a cow-calf operation with about 70 head and sold hay to horse farms and small cattle operations within 50 miles. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a struggling man. He was the kind of farmer who had equity in his land and equipment, but operated close enough to the margin that every purchase required months of consideration. His sons, Michael and Brian, had both left farming. Michael worked as a machinist in Columbia. Brian managed a feed store in Fulton. Neither had interest in coming back. Howard had accepted this by the time he turned 60, though he'd never said so directly. The New Holland 688 had come into Howard's operation in March of 1998. He'd been running a smaller square baler, an old Heston that required constant repair and produced bales his back couldn't handle anymore. He was 56 then. His doctor had told him that if he wanted to keep farming, he needed to stop lifting 70-pound bales 800 times a summer. The round baler had been owned by Eugene Weber, a farmer 2 miles north who was selling out after his wife died. Eugene had maintained it obsessively. Grease on schedule, belts replaced before they showed cord. He'd kept it in a shed with 3 sides and a roof, which in Missouri was as good as climate control. Howard test ran it on a Thursday afternoon in Eugene's field. It fed cleanly. The rollers were tight, the knotter tied without hesitation. Eugene wanted $9,500. Howard offered $8,000. They settled at $8,200, and Howard wrote the check that evening. He told his wife, Linda, that the baler would last him until he quit farming. She asked when that would be. He said he figured another 10 years, 12 at most. The 688 was not New Holland's newest model even in 1998. It had been manufactured in 1991. It was a fixed-chamber baler, simple hydraulics, mechanical knotters, belt-driven pickup. No computers, no sensors. It made 4x5 bales that weighed between 800 and 1,100 pounds depending on moisture and how tight Howard set the tension. It was the kind of machine that a man could understand completely if he was willing to crawl underneath it with a flashlight and a wrench. Howard was that kind of man. Turning point. The baler ran without significant issue for 11 years. In 2009, Howard replaced the pickup teeth and the main drive belt. In 2012, he rebuilt the hydraulic ram that controlled the tailgate. In 2015, he replaced all 6 baler belts at once because 2 were showing wear and he didn't want to do the job twice. Each repair cost between $600 and $1,400. Each time, Howard considered whether it made sense to keep fixing a machine that was already old when he bought it. Each time, he did the math and concluded that repair was cheaper than replacement. By 2016, the 688 had been in Howard's operation for 18 years. It was 25 years old. Dealers no longer stocked parts for it. When something broke, Howard ordered from online suppliers or searched salvage yards. His sons started suggesting replacement. Michael visited one Sunday in April 2016 and walked out to the shed where Howard kept the baler. He looked at it for a long time. The sun-faded red paint, the patches of rust along the frame, the way the belt sagged slightly even when the tension was released. He said, "Dad, you know they make new ones." Howard was greasing the pickup. He didn't look up. "This one works. It's older than my truck. Your truck runs." Michael tried a different approach. "What happens if something major breaks? I fix it. What if you can't get parts? I get parts. What if it quits in the middle of cutting and you lose hay to weather?" Howard stopped greasing and looked at his son. "Then I lose hay, same as I would if I was making payments on a new baler and couldn't afford fuel." Michael didn't push further. He knew the tone. It was the same tone Howard had used 20 years earlier when Michael suggested selling some ground to pay for college. The tone that meant the conversation was finished. Brian tried once in 2017. He came out to the farm on a Saturday and found Howard replacing a bearing in the baler's main roller. The bearing had cost $140. Howard had driven to a farm equipment salvage yard in Mexico, Missouri, 40 miles each way, to find one that fit. Brian watched him work for a while, then said, "You spend more time fixing that thing than using it." Howard slid the roller back into place and bolted the housing down. "I know this machine. I know what it'll do and what it won't. I know what breaks and how to fix it. You buy new, you get computers and sensors and problems you can't solve in your own shop. You get reliability. You get debt." Brian started to respond, then stopped. He could see that his father wasn't being stubborn. He was being consistent with a principle that had governed 40 years of farming. Avoid debt, maintain what you own, trust what you know. It was hard to argue against a principle that had kept the farm solvent. Long consequence arc. The summer of 2017 was dry. Howard got 3 cuttings, but the third was thin. He baled 2,100 rounds total. The 688 ran through all of it without breakdown. In 2018, the spring was wet and the summer was perfect. Howard got 4 cuttings. He baled 2,850 rounds. The baler had a belt slip in July. A tensioner bolt had loosened, but Howard caught it before it caused damage. He tightened the bolt and kept running. That winter, Linda asked him what he planned to do about the baler. He said, "What do you mean? It's 20 years old. 27. Exactly." Howard was sitting at the kitchen table with a parts catalog, pricing bearings for the spring. He didn't look up. "It runs." "How long are you going to say that?" "Long as it's true." Linda didn't argue. She'd learned decades ago that Howard made decisions slowly and kept them permanently, but she noticed that he spent more time in the shop that winter than usual. He pulled the pickup apart and inspected every tooth. He checked every bolt on the frame. He drained the hydraulic fluid and looked for metal shavings. He found nothing alarming. In March 2019, he ordered new pickup teeth, even though the old ones had another season left. He told Linda it was preventive. She didn't say what she was thinking, that preventive maintenance on a 28-year-old machine was like careful driving in a car with bad brakes. The spring of 2019 came early and wet. By late May, the first cutting was ready. Howard started baling on May 23rd. The 688 ran for 6 days straight. He finished the first cutting on May 28th, with 920 bales made. On May 30th, he was greasing the baler when he noticed a thin crack in the frame near the main roller housing. It was barely visible, maybe 4 inches long, hairline width. He ran his finger over it. The metal felt solid. He didn't mention it to Linda. He told himself he'd weld it before second cutting. But second cutting came faster than expected. The weather turned hot and the grass grew quickly. By June 10th, the hay was ready. Howard started cutting on June 11th. He told himself he'd weld the crack when he finished. The baler ran for 3 days. On the morning of June 14th, Howard noticed the crack had lengthened. It was now 8 or 9 inches. Still hairline. Still not through the metal. He had 140 acres left to bale. The forecast called for rain Sunday night. He decided to finish first, weld second. At 2:47 that afternoon, the bearing in the main roller failed. It didn't fail gradually. It seized instantly. The roller locked. The belt feeding hay into the chamber pulled tight and snapped. The drive chain jumped off its sprocket and whipped sideways into the frame. The sound was metal against metal at full speed, a shriek that cut through the tractor engine noise and the wind and the locusts in the trees at the edge of the field. Howard clutched out and hit the brakes. The tractor stopped. The baler sat behind him in a cloud of dust and bits of hay floating in the sun. He sat in the cab and didn't move for a long time. Then he shut off the tractor and climbed down. The bearing had destroyed itself completely. The roller it supported had gouged a groove into the housing. The belt that snapped had torn through in 3 places. The drive chain had bent 2 links and cracked the chain guard. Howard stood next to the baler and looked at the damage in the bright sun heat that made his shirt stick to his back. He could fix this. He'd fixed worse. But not today. Not in this field. Not in time to beat the rain. He took his phone out of his pocket and called Michael. Michael didn't answer. Howard left a message. "Baler's down. Need a bearing and a belt. Maybe a chain. I'll text you the part numbers." He called Brian. Brian answered on the 3rd ring. "You busy?" Howard asked. "I'm at work. What's wrong?" "Baler quit. I need parts. Can you pick them up after work and bring them out?" "What broke?" "Main roller bearing, drive belt, maybe the chain." There was a pause. "Dad, that's a full day's work at least." "I know. The rain's coming Sunday." "I know." Another pause. "How old is that baler?" Howard looked at it. The red paint was almost pink in places where the sun had bleached it. Rust showed through along every edge. The tires were cracked. The tongue was bent slightly from 20 years of being towed over rough ground. "Old enough," Howard said. Brian came out that evening with the bearing and belt. Howard had already pulled the roller and removed the destroyed bearing. They worked under trouble lights in the field until 11 o'clock. The bearing pressed in clean. The belt went on with difficulty. It was slightly longer than the original and required adjusting 3 tensioners. The chain was salvageable. Howard straightened the bent links with a hammer and a punch. By midnight, the baler was reassembled. Howard test ran it in the dark. It fed correctly. The roller turned smooth. The knotter tied. Brian stood next to the tractor and watched. "You should replace this thing," he said. Howard shut off the tractor. "Maybe. Not maybe. You should." Howard climbed down. His back hurt. His hands were covered in grease and dust that had turned to paste with sweat. "I'll think about it," he said. Brian looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. They drove back to the house separately. Linda was still awake. She made coffee, and they sat at the table while Howard explained what had broken and how they'd fixed it. She didn't ask if he was going to replace the baler. She'd asked that question enough times to know the answer. Howard finished baling on Saturday. He worked from dawn until 8 o'clock that night. The 6 and 88 ran without issue. He made the last bale at 7:52 p.m., ejected it into the field, and drove the tractor and baler back to the shed. The rain came Sunday night as forecasted. Howard had beaten it by 18 hours. Late revelation. In the spring of 2020, Howard ordered parts for the baler's annual maintenance. The bearing supplier he'd used for 15 years no longer carried the size he needed. He found it eventually through a supplier in Iowa, but the price had doubled. In June, the hydraulic ram that controlled the tailgate started leaking. Howard rebuilt it for the 2nd time. The seals cost $180. They lasted 6 weeks. When they failed again, Howard couldn't find replacements. The manufacturer had discontinued that model of ram entirely. He fabricated a solution using seals from a different brand that were close in size. It worked, but it wept fluid constantly. He kept a jug of hydraulic fluid in the tractor cab and topped off the reservoir every morning. His sons didn't visit as often that summer. Michael had taken a 2nd job. Brian's store had expanded and his hours increased. When they did visit, they looked at the baler and didn't say anything. Linda asked Howard in July if he'd thought more about replacing it. He said he had. She asked what he'd decided. He said he'd decided to run it another year. In the fall of 2020, Howard started having chest pain. He ignored it for 3 weeks before Linda forced him to see a doctor. The doctor ordered tests. The tests showed arterial blockage. The cardiologist said Howard needed a stent. The procedure was scheduled for November 18th. Howard came home 2 days later with instructions to avoid heavy lifting and strenuous work for 6 weeks. He followed the instructions for 10 days. Then he went back to the shop and started winterizing equipment. Linda found him underneath the baler, draining the hydraulic system. She didn't yell. She stood there until he slid out from under the machine. The doctor said 6 weeks, she said. I'm not lifting anything heavy. Howard. He looked at her. His face was thinner than it had been a year ago. The skin around his eyes looked papery. I'm fine, he said. You're 68 years old and you just had heart surgery. I had a stent. That's not surgery. You're not fine. Howard stood up slowly. His chest didn't hurt anymore, but he felt tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I'm fine enough, he said. The summer of 2021 started cool and wet. The first cutting was late and heavy. Howard began baling on June 3rd. The 688 ran for 4 days before a pickup tooth sheared off and jammed the feed system. Howard cleared the jam and replaced the tooth. It took 3 hours. 2 days later, the belt tensioner froze and the belt slipped off the rollers. Howard disassembled the tensioner, cleaned it, and reassembled it. It took 5 hours. On June 12th, the knotter stopped tying. Howard spent an entire morning adjusting it before discovering that the knife blade was worn to nothing. He didn't have a replacement. He ordered one online with expedited shipping. It arrived June 15th. He installed it that afternoon. By June 16th, Howard was 8 days behind schedule. The hay was getting over mature. If he didn't finish soon, the quality would drop and he'd lose sales. He started baling at 5:30 a.m. on June 17th. The temperature that day reached 94 degrees by noon. The humidity was 70%. The heat index was above 105. Howard stopped once at 10 o'clock to drink water. He stopped again at 1 o'clock to eat a sandwich. He didn't stop the tractor. He ate while circling the field, watching the baler through the rear window. At 3:15, he felt the pain start in his chest. It wasn't sharp, it was pressure, like someone pressing a fist against his sternum. He kept driving. The pain got worse. He told himself it was indigestion. He told himself it was the heat. He told himself he'd stop at the end of the round and rest in the shade. At 3:22, the pressure became crushing. Howard took his foot off the throttle. The tractor slowed. He reached for the gear shift to put it in neutral. His left arm went numb. The tractor rolled to a stop. The engine kept running. Behind him, the baler kept turning, kept feeding, kept forming a bale that would never be finished. Howard tried to reach for his phone. He couldn't move his left arm. He reached with his right hand, but the phone was in his left pocket. The pain in his chest spread into his jaw. He tried to open the cab door. His hand found the latch, but couldn't pull it. The tractor sat in the middle of the field with the engine idling and the baler running, and Howard slumped in the seat with his hand on the door latch and the sun coming through the glass. Linda found him at 6:30 that evening. She'd called his phone 4 times. When he didn't answer, she drove out to the field. She saw the tractor from the road, sitting still with the engine running in the middle of cut hay. She knew before she reached him. The coroner's report listed the time of death as approximately 3:30 p.m. The cause was myocardial infarction, massive and sudden. The cardiologist told Linda afterward that Howard wouldn't have felt much after the first minute. The pain would have been severe, but brief. Linda asked if it would have made a difference if someone had been with him. The cardiologist said maybe, if they'd called immediately, if the ambulance had been close, but probably not. The new Holland 688 baler was sold at Howard's estate auction in September 2021. It went for $1,200. The buyer was a young farmer from Montgomery County who said he needed a cheap baler to get started. He asked Michael if it ran well. Michael said it ran. He didn't say anything else. The baler left on a trailer behind a truck that was newer than the machine it carried. Linda sold the farm in 2022. She moved into town, into a house with a small yard and neighbors close enough to wave to. She kept the tractor, a New Holland T 4.75 that Howard had bought new in 2014. It sat in her garage, cleaned and maintained, never used. Michael asked her once why she kept it. She said she wasn't sure. Maybe because Howard had chosen it carefully. Maybe because it represented something about how he'd approached farming, deliberately, without debt, with an eye toward lasting. Michael didn't ask about the baler. Nobody talked about the baler. But on quiet evenings, when Linda sat on her porch and watched the light fade over town, she thought about it sometimes. She thought about the day Howard bought it in 1998. How proud he'd been to get it for a good price. How certain he'd been that it would last. She thought about all the years it did last, all the hay it baled, all the repairs Howard made in the shed by himself, figuring out problems with a wrench and a flashlight and patience. She thought about the crack he didn't weld. She thought about the heat that day in June. She thought about whether the baler had anything to do with what happened, or whether Howard would have died that day regardless, working too hard, refusing to stop, pushing himself past the limits his body would tolerate, because that's what farmers did. She didn't have an answer. The young farmer who bought the baler ran it for 2 seasons. In the summer of 2023, the frame cracked completely near the main roller housing. The roller seized. The baler became unfixable without welding and machining that would cost more than the machine was worth. He sold it for scrap. It brought $340. Equipment lasts as long as it lasts. The New Holland 688 lasted 32 years. It baled more than 50,000 rounds of hay in that time. It survived 3 owners and more repairs than anyone counted. It served Howard Dennison for 23 years. Whether it served him well depends on how you measure service. If you measure it in bales made and money saved, it served him perfectly. If you measure it differently, in risks deferred, in warnings ignored, in the price of loyalty to machines that outlast their wisdom, the answer is harder. Howard believed in keeping what you owned, in avoiding debt, in trusting what you knew. Those beliefs kept him farming for 42 years. Those beliefs kept him in a field alone on a June afternoon when his body quit before his work was finished. The New Holland baler didn't kill Howard Dennison, but it was there when he died, running behind a tractor in the heat, doing the job it had been built to do decades before. And in the years afterward, when people who knew him talked about farming and equipment and the choices men make, some of them mentioned the baler. Not to blame it, but not to forget it either.